You've probably heard the name. In the 1990s, the Bobbit case became one of the biggest and most joked about stories on the planet. But behind all those late-night punchlines was a really dark and complex human story. So today, we're going to go beyond the shocking headline and try to understand what was really going on. I mean, from the second this story broke, it was an absolute media firestorm. It was on every tabloid cover, every news report, this sensational story about a marriage gone berserk. But the thing is, the sheer shock of the act itself completely buried the much darker, much more complicated story that led up to it. And that really brings us to the central question, doesn't it? Most people know what happened, but the why? Well, the why is a tangled mess of conflicting stories, accusations of terrible abuse, and a relationship that had totally fallen apart. To even begin to understand the why, you have to start with the who. So let's meet the couple at the very center of this storm. So on one side, you have John Wayne Bobbitt. He's 26, a former U.S. Marine. And on the other, there's Lorena Gallo, a 24-year-old immigrant who came here from Venezuela trying to live the American dream. They met at a Marine Corps ball and they got married pretty quickly in 1989, partly because Lorena's visa status was a factor. So right from the get-go, their relationship was under a lot of pressure. So what was life actually like for them? What was going on inside that marriage? Well, that's where things get incredibly complicated, because it really truly depends on who you ask. And this right here is the absolute core of the entire saga, irreconcilable narratives. We're not talking about small disagreements. We're talking about two people who were living in the same house but describing completely opposite realities. John's version was a picture of a rocky, volatile relationship. Lorena's, it was a nightmare of constant, systematic abuse. And this wasn't all just happening behind closed doors. Things were turbulent enough that the police were actually called to their home for domestic violence complaints about half a dozen times. 6 times. Now, from John's perspective, this relationship was volatile on both sides. He said they'd fight over stupid stuff and that Lorena could be stubborn and had a real temper. In fact, a friend of his even saw her stab him in the hand with a fork. It wasn't always one-sided either. At one point, the police arrested both of them for assault. On top of that, Lorena was having some other legal issues, including getting caught shoplifting and embezzling thousands from her job. Okay, so let's really break down the biggest points of disagreement. This is where their two realities just completely and totally split apart. When it came to physical abuse, Lorena claimed it started almost right away, just 1 month into the marriage. But John, he framed it completely differently. He admitted they had physical fights and that he would restrain her in ways that might have left marks. But in his mind, that was fighting with each other, not spousal abuse. This huge difference in perspective carried over into one of the most painful moments of their marriage. Lorena got pregnant, and she was really excited about it. But she later said she felt forced to have an abortion, and that it left her with terrible trauma. John remembers it differently. He saw it as a practical suggestion to wait, and while he knew she was unhappy about it, he framed it as a tough but mutual decision. So you have all this tension, all of these completely opposing stories, and it was all building to a breaking point on one single night. June 23rd, 1993. So let's walk through the events leading up to it. A week before, John told Lorena he wanted a divorce, which she said just devastated her. Then, just before the incident, a neighbor had actually given her some pamphlets about marital rape, a concept she was really just learning about. Then, on that night, John came home drunk, and what happened next is the single most contested moment of this entire story. Their stories about what happened in that bed could not be more different. Lorena describes a violent rape. She says he forced himself on her while she was telling him no. John's version? He denies it completely. He claims he was asleep, that he has no memory of any kind of sexual encounter, and that he has never, ever raped anyone. According to Lorena, after the alleged assault happened, she got out of bed and went to the kitchen to get some water. She saw a knife on the counter, and in that moment, she said years of alleged abuse, the trauma of the abortion, the fighting, everything just came rushing back to her in this overwhelming wave. And then she went back to the bedroom. The act itself was really just the beginning of the public story. The aftermath is what created this bizarre legal paradox and turned a very real human tragedy into a national spectacle. What happened next in court was, well, it was stunning. There were 2 separate trials, and they produced this incredible legal outcome. First, a jury found John not guilty of marital sexual assault. Then, in a completely separate trial, another jury found Lorena not guilty of malicious wounding because they believed she was temporarily insane due to the abuse she'd suffered. So, at the end of the day, in the eyes of the law, neither of them was guilty. And while all this was playing out in court, the media, well, they just ran with the spectacle. The whole thing became a punchline. Any serious conversation we could have been having about domestic violence or marital rape was just completely lost in the noise and the jokes. After their divorce in 1995, their lives just went in these two completely opposite directions. John decided to capitalize on his newfound infamous fame. He got into adult films, made appearances, that whole scene. Lorena, on the other hand, went back to using her maiden name, Gallo, and became a really passionate advocate for victims of domestic violence, even starting her own foundation. Now, decades later, the way we talk about these things has totally shifted. What was once just seen as this bizarre, shocking story is being looked at again, especially now in the #MeToo era. People are starting to see this case not as a joke, but as a really serious, searing example of domestic abuse and how the system so often fails victims. And really, that's the powerful, difficult question the Bobbit case leaves us with. It forces you to look past the sensational headline, to look past the easy punchline, and to really consider the incredibly complicated, painful, and conflicting human stories that are always underneath. It's a question we are still grappling with today.